So, fun with food preservation. Um, there are obviously lots of ways to treat it seriously and respectfully in terms of health and proper procedures, but it can also be a lot of fun. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Not a lot of detailed information about the specifics. You can certainly ask questions about that. Just a general idea of some really cool things that you can do. And there we go. So this is one of my favorite pictures. Food preservation is basically keeping food from spoiling, whether it's short-term preservation or long-term preservation. Short-term, we know, keeping food in our fridge preserves it rather than leaving it out at room temperature. Long-term preservation has been practiced forever. I love this picture. I don't have the rights to it, as you can see, but it is fabulous, and I probably should credit the people who posted it. This is a really old, basically a bath, a tub that they fill with salt water directly from the ocean, boil it down to get salt to cure food. So really simplistic, but really effective at the same time. Actually a lot of reasons why we should preserve food. In no particular order, saving money. So we all know that there is a lot of money wasted in terms of food spoilage. A lot of it is out of our hands. It happens before the food even gets into our home, but we're responsible for it when we choose it and buy it from the grocery store and when we have it at home. So finding ways to use it where you think the alternative might be throwing it away, there are options to preserve it or turn it into something else. And that way you are saving money. Reducing waste is the same thing. If you can't eat it in time before it's going bad, there are ways you can preserve it to extend its life and not have to throw it away and still be able to enjoy it. It does speed up cooking. There are certain methods where the food is actually either partially cooked or preserved in such a way that when you are going to use it, it's much faster. So that's a plus for a lot of us. Long-term storage, obviously, which is really great for things that are out of season, especially to be able to enjoy them in the off season, which is something we are lucky enough to be able to do. Quality and flavor cannot be beat when you are doing your own food preservation. We can get preserved food from commercial sources, obviously, and a lot of us do. Canned food, frozen food, all that kind of stuff. Making your own, you just can't beat the quality, especially if you're using things that are fresh and in season. And in terms of it being a life skill, it's never going to go wrong. You're never going to not need this in one way or another. Even just knowing what to do with, a leftover serving of, I don't know, pasta sauce. It's a skill that you can have a tiny bit of knowledge about and still be able to implement it. You can obviously have a ton of knowledge and be able to share that with other people, which is what I'm doing today. Yay. Emergency prep is important for a lot of people. And whether you're prepping for, a pandemic, or you're prepping for winter when you don't have as much access to fresh produce or the fresh produce that you want, or you're just prepping for a weekend where, you're not going to want to cook and you want to have some food that's ready to consume. There are lots of ways and lots of options depending on what your goal is. Personal satisfaction can't be beat. It's like anything you make yourself, craft yourself. The satisfaction of actually, looking at jars on your shelf or looking at packages of dehydrated food is really special. And everyone who tries this, everyone who does any aspect of it should be really proud of themselves. Gift giving goes without saying. If you have ever received a jar of salsa that somebody canned from produce that they grew in their own garden, or jam made from, peaches that are in season, it can't be beat. So they're truly a labor of love and they're gifts from the heart. And my biggest reason, I don't know if it's my biggest reason, but it's the one I try and focus on, is how environmentally friendly food preservation is. Basically, all of these reasons add up to lowering our food footprint. So when we buy things local, when we buy them in season, we're reducing the amount of travel time and cost and resources used to bring food to us. We're saving money by being able to buy local, being able to buy in larger quantities because we are going to preserve them. A lot of the food preservation techniques don't take a lot of energy to do and to store, which obviously cuts down on our energy consumption all around in terms of food. So lots of, and gift giving, I mean, being able to give something that's handmade and not coming from a store is just fabulous. So if I haven't convinced you already, we're going to go through a few types of food preservation and see what appeals to you or see what you've done already. Food preservation has been around as long as people have been around in various forms. So drying, smoking, refrigeration of one type or another, and fermentation. Obviously, with the advances in technology, as well as chemically, the addition of electricity, we've been able to add lots of different methods, including canning, pasteurization, freezing, curing, pickling, freeze drying, and the addition of chemicals. So any one of these gives you food that will not spoil. Lots of different pros and cons to each of these, and we're going to touch on some of them. So even though it does say this isn't your granny's canning, canning is awesome. Canning has its place for a lot of things. I have given pros and cons of each of these options. And the cons aren't really to dissuade you from doing it. They're just to make you aware that there are differences and there are advantages and disadvantages to each kind of food preservation. So canning, my classic example here is canned peaches, which we do every fall, August, September. It should say on here because if people label them properly. Because if you've ever opened a can of produce that was preserved in its prime in season, there is nothing like it. In the middle of winter, being able to access fresh tasting produce like this can't be beat. So it does have a long shelf life. It's convenient to store, just like the picture here, because it doesn't require a set temperature, certainly doesn't require any energy, and you can do a lot together. And one of the great things about canning is sort of its history as a communal project. You know, the whole family or a community gets together when it's harvest time for a particular kind of produce and cans it as a group, and then everyone takes their share. To start up with, if you don't have any supplies, it can be expensive, but once you have them, you will have them for life, and you can also share them. There are also places like lending libraries where you can borrow most of the equipment. And certainly in terms of jars, there are people sharing them everywhere, because once you start canning, you will have a lot of jars. There is skill needed to store it safely. Some of it's less difficult than others. Learning from someone who does it is always the best way, in my opinion. There are resources online, there are books and videos, so many. Because I'm all about preserving includes food, but it also includes traditions and culture and knowledge. And that means learning from people who have come before us. There is an energy usage up front for canning because it does require heat, electricity, gas, whatever you're using. And if anyone ever has done any canning, it is very time consuming. Again, I'm not trying to dissuade anyone, just to present information. Spending a day canning and looking at your stash of beautifully canned produce at the end of the day is incredibly satisfying. So freezing is something we all do. We probably do a lot of it without even thinking about it. It is very fast to do. It's fairly easy. There are some foods that require a little more attention than others. The great thing about freezing is it retains all the nutrients in the food. The downside, and again, we all freeze because, you know, we're lucky enough to have access to electricity. The energy use doesn't stop with the preservation process. It continues through the life of the food that you're freezing, because it continually needs to be frozen, and that requires electricity. So there is that ongoing draw on resources as well as the expense. There are a lot of foods where the texture changes with freezing. Again, not to dissuade you, but it's something to just be aware of. And depending on your home situation, it can take up a lot of space. Some people have, you know, separate freezers where they get, you know, large orders of produce or meat. So it depends on your lifestyle and depends if that works for you. So I'm going to, I'm not going to show you any frozen produce because I think we all know what that looks like. And I am going to show you one little, I'm going to call it a hack that we use. So our family is addicted to lemons. We love lemons. So we try and make the most of them. Obviously, they're not available locally. We use the lemon juice, and then we freeze in our milk bags, which we reuse a lot. We just freeze the empty lemon. This is half a lemon. And we just freeze them because there is a lot of juice and a lot of flavor. And then we just use them as ice cubes. So if anyone likes lemon water, either hot or cold, pouring that over half of a lemon, that even though the juice is gone from the inside, there is so much flavor and there's still pulp. And it's a great way to not only store something, because we couldn't keep them in the fridge for long enough, but to use something that would otherwise have served its purpose already. So being able to reuse something obviously saves the food from being wasted. At the end of this, we can still compost it, of course, but it gets a second life, which is kind of awesome. I am going to, I think, flip back to my screen and, oh, yes, fermenting, yay. This is one of my favorites. So fermenting is basically using carbs, often sugar, and the ambient bacteria in the air to ferment products. It's kind of, I mean, there's a lot of science behind it. This is the tip of the iceberg, but it's an awesome process. And there are so many variations, so many foods you can ferment. Probably the biggest reason it's, I want to say, kind of trendy right now, especially if we're talking kombucha, which I will show you in a minute, is the fermentation process creates probiotics, which of course we know are amazing for us, improve our digestion, strengthen our immune system. There are foods as well as beverages that you can ferment, which is a pretty cool reason for doing it. So, you know, if you're not into, you know, sauerkraut, or if you're not a fan of yogurt, there are still ways that you can drink fermented items that will give you the same benefits. So limited uses, which is true for all kinds of preservation. There are only certain foods, certain beverages that you can implement fermenting with. Initially, it can cause bloating, which is something most people who journey into fermenting just start small and you get used to it, and then the benefits far outweigh the initial discomfort. Now, fermenting, I want to say across the board, and I don't think I'm wrong, generally gives a tangy flavor. And depending how strongly you ferment something, how long you let the fermentation process go can change how strong that tanginess is. And if you're doing it yourself, you can do it to your liking, which is pretty awesome. So kombucha is trending and it's amazing. When you buy it in the store, it looks a lot nicer than what you'll see in this jar here. Here's another one with a smaller SCOBY on top. So the SCOBY is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And that in combination with, this is just tea, and it has sugar, and it pulls the bacteria from the air. Magic process happens, and you end up with a fermented beverage, which is, of course, longer lasting than just the regular tea that you started with. And I mean, I could spend a long time talking about kombucha, and I've done workshops just on kombucha alone. But the premise is the fermentation is a process. So unlike canning, where you can something, you put it in a hot water bath for 20 minutes, it's done. Fermentation can take days, sometimes weeks, and it's a system where you get to know what you like. I have a really good friend who I got onto brewing kombucha, and you wouldn't even know they're the same beverage, hers and mine. Mine is tangy, mine has quite a bite to it, and hers tastes like a sweet drink. Now, she may not be getting the full benefits of all the probiotics if she let it ferment longer, but it's more palatable to her this way, so she's actually consuming it. So you get to weigh that yourself. I am going to do, we're not going to brew kombucha, but I'm going to show you a couple of things. So this is the kombucha I'm drinking at the moment. And what I've got in here, I don't know if you can see that well. Don't want to pour it on my computer. I have a dehydrated slice of orange, which is adding to the flavor there. And I also have a strawberry stem, which I've dried. Strawberry stems dried are amazing because they still have strawberry flavor, obviously. They work great in tea, hot water, clearly, kombucha. But the leaves also have a lot of vitamins, and they're really good for your digestion. So brewing those, adding them to something, if you're growing strawberries, it's fabulous because you get the fruit, which is amazing, but you also get to use the other parts of the plant. But what I am going to do is I'm going to ferment some fruit. And again, what we're using is sugar. And in this case, we're using honey, locally sourced honey, which is awesome. Buy local. And this is probably one of the coolest things that I discovered a few years ago. So this is cranberries, frozen cranberries. If anyone's ever bought cranberries to, I don't know, make cranberry sauce, and you have some left over, they go in the freezer and then you forget about them because you're not making more cranberry sauce. This is an incredible way to use them. So basically these are frozen. If you have fresh, you will have to give them a little slit with a knife to make sure that the honey can absorb in because the shell is quite hard. And what I'm going to do is, it's not tricky at all, pour the honey onto the cranberries, and you could mix it, but what I'm going to do is put a lid on. You can do this in a jar, anything, and leave it on my counter because I want it to be room temperature. Every, I don't know, whenever you walk by, give it a little shake to make sure the cranberries are covered. A couple of times a day, you want to just pop the top off quickly to let it breathe because gases do build up. And then you can taste it. It's kind of miraculous because in a few days, I usually leave mine for 4 or 5, but again, it depends on the temperature and where you have it. If you have it quite warm, it might ferment faster. The two mixed together, you do get that tangy, even though there's honey, you get that tangy flavor, partly from the fermentation process, partly from the cranberries. The cranberries become sweeter, the honey becomes flavored and tangy, and you end up with, oh, mine's already in the fridge. Hang on. Oh no, where is it? Oh, there it is. Sorry, bear with me. Here we go. I've got this here. this is the cranberries, and this is the honey. The honey liquefies because of the fruit that's in there and the water content. It is an absolutely delightful, it's its own thing. It's not even just cranberries anymore. It's not just flavored honey. This is great to serve on meat, cheese, mixed in with yogurt, in a smoothie bowl, in muffins. It's incredible. So I encourage you to try this. Once it has fermented, you do want to refrigerate it. And then it keeps for a really long time. And what I do is I have this one, and I have this one that will be sitting on the counter for a few days. When this one is ready, I'm just going to pour it into here and keep them together. Any fruit that is, this isn't a technical term, but kind of mushy. So blueberries, if you crack them open, strawberries for sure. Strawberries will change a lot in texture, but that's okay. You get kind of this compote. I've done rhubarb as well, which is kind of awesome because similar to cranberries, it does start out quite tart, and then you get this flavor infused honey liquid goodness. And by the way, this is also incredible for flavoring kombucha. If you've ever done a second ferment and you want to add flavor to your kombucha, incredible. Yeah, so that is a great way to ferment something that you may not have thought of before, and using honey is a fabulous option. And like I said, support local. So I'm going to put my fermenting things away. Oops, and wash my hands. And move on to our next slide. Oh, my hands are wet. There we go. Dehydrating. So dehydrating is just fabulous. I think one of the reasons I like it so much is you can have so much fun with it. It is so diverse. A lot of it is really easy to do. The flavor of anything you dehydrate really intensifies because you're basically removing liquid, which for a lot of produce is water. And what you're left with is a really concentrated flavor. Things can last a long time when they're dehydrated. I will show you some jars of dehydrated produce. And in terms of combinations, which we'll get to in a little bit, and my son is doing in that picture, they're truly limitless. So initial energy use, yes, because you do need a heat source. Some climates in some places, I'm saying that hesitantly because I'm looking out on a rainy day where dehydrating is a challenge because there's so much moisture in the air. Solar dehydration is definitely an option. You can build your own solar dehydrator. You can buy an electric one. You can use your oven. Lots of great options. So you don't need a lot of equipment to get started. And depending what you're dehydrating, and I don't know if this is actually a disadvantage, some of the items can be higher in sugar. For example, and I'm going to run back to my pantry here. I have, here we go. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. Dehydrated strawberries. So obviously you've removed the moisture and what you have left is strawberry, and it's incredibly sweet and incredibly concentrated. If you're using them like this, you know, in trail mix or granola, the flavor is very intense and obviously the sugar is higher. So just something to keep in mind. Yes, so I wanted to show you produce. So here we have, this is just a jar of zucchini. So I just sliced it. It's not cooked because zucchini is so watery. It doesn't take any It takes very little time and very little water to rehydrate it. So these are just dried. You can hear from the sound that they're dried and crispy. So they're okay to put in a jar. We don't have to worry about them going moldy, and they're ready to use almost instantly, again, because they rehydrate so easily. And I'll go back to this. So in terms of why we dehydrate food or what the goal is, I've broken it down into 3 sort of separate categories. So one reason is to, obviously we're talking about preserving the food, but preserving it so that you can use it in its original form. And I'll show you that with some garlic that I dried. Consuming it in its dried state. So we're not trying to rehydrate it at any point. We're drying it for the sake of using it as a dried item. And we'll get to that with my kale that's in my food dehydrator. And in terms of creating a new food, this is where the most fun comes in. If anyone's ever had fruit roll-ups, this is probably the most fun, or if you've ever made your own crackers, which we'll kind of talk about, that is a great way to combine foods, to dry foods. This is a fruit roll-up, to turn it into something entirely different. And whether it's a snack food, whether it's a staple, being able to play like that and take bits and pieces and turn it into something different that you've created yourself is kind of awesome. So the first one we're going to start with is garlic, because if you do buy it in season and you buy it locally, it's really, really cheap. And being able to dry it and then have access to it all year round is pretty incredible. And the flavor is as intense as when it was first harvested, which is kind of awesome. So I'm going to show you what that looked like and a bit about the drying process. And then we'll talk about the other options as well. Oops. So here we have garlic. I bought it in the summer from a local farmer. That's not a nice way to show it. Let's do this. And obviously I wasn't going to use it all at once. So what I did was slice it and dehydrate it. And that way, anything I'm going to be using it for, it's ready to go. And what I would do is, do I have this ready? No, I don't. Take some water. There are many discussions about what temperature water to use when you're rehydrating. Some people suggest cold water because it will not create an ideal temperature for breeding bacteria. If you're in a hurry and it's dinner time, hot water does the trick. And also you're going to be using it right away. So I can put the garlic right into some water. Depending on how dry it is, depending on how thick the pieces is, how thick they are, it might be about 20 minutes for it to return to a state where you can chop it, you could add it to whatever you're cooking. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't have a use for the garlic today, so I don't want to waste it. But that is a great thing to do with so many vegetables. I tried to dig in my cupboard to find some and I couldn't find them, but we do a lot of onions, just raw onions and sliced, mostly because it comes and goes in terms of usage. Being able to grab a handful of dried onions, pop them in a bowl of water, and then have onions ready for your dinner is a fabulous option. You can store them in a jar. And it depends on your lifestyle. If you're in the kitchen all the time and you can go through, however many onions you've bought at the market without having to worry about them, I was going to say going bad or drying out. In our case, it's usually the container that we keep them in falls in the pantry and then we have to clean up onion skins. So doing a whole batch at once is an awesome plan for us. I'm going to see if I can slide this over to show you my dehydrator, because I've got one other vegetable here that is something you can use to, you can dehydrate this. Taste between the dried onions and fresh. Taste-wise, no. Texture-wise, there definitely is, there definitely is a little bit of difference texture-wise, but it also depends how you're cooking them. If you're rehydrating them in, say, soup, for example, you probably won't notice a difference. I use them a lot in stir fries, and I certainly don't notice a difference. What I do notice is that it's a lot faster, and like I said, being able to open a jar and grab a handful is kind of awesome. So what I have here, does anyone want to see my dehydrator? Is that of interest to anyone, or do we know what a dehydrator looks like here? So when I first started dehydrating, I thought I was just going to play around, so I bought the cheapest one I could find. This one was from Canadian Tire, and it was half price, so it cost me $30. It is not a fancy model by any means. What it does have, which is awesome, is a temperature gauge. Where am I pointing? Over here. Which is really useful because there are reasons and, different produce, different things that you're making that do require different temperatures. So that was one thing I was looking for. It's a weird thing to use for some items because it does have a hole in the middle, which makes some things tricky. But all in all, I've been using this one for years. It's fairly slow because it is small. It has a small motor. You can get giant, you know, oven-sized ones with huge trays that probably take probably a quarter of the time that this would take. But this is what I have, and it works for my needs. Most of them, no, I'm sure all dehydrators have different layers. So they have different trays. They all stack nicely on top of each other. Some of them have trays with varying heights, which would be really handy. This one doesn't. So what I have up here is kale. So it's just, I did take the stem off because the stem is a different texture than the leaves, and therefore would dry at a different rate. So these, as you can hear, I don't want to do this over my computer. They're dried, really crunchy. So I could just crumble it up. And the reason I'm doing that is, this is depending what you want to do with your dried items. So I can just store these in a jar, and when I'm making something that calls for kale, something cooked, I can just add those right in. I can rehydrate them and add them back in. One thing, do you store your dried foods in a sealed jar at room temperature? Definitely sealed. And the reason for that is the air has moisture in it. So you've gone to all this work of dehydrating, you don't want to add moisture until you're ready to. If space-wise you can't store it at room temperature, you could always store dried things in the fridge or freezer. And there's no trick to storing them. Literally a bag, a jar, any kind of airtight container, and just they don't take up much room at all, again, because most of the moisture is gone. I'm going to grab some kale from the fridge here. And I'm going to spend one quick minute talking about, throw the dried kale in a smoothie. Oh, you beat me to it. I'll get to the smoothie in a second, because that is one of our favorites. So short-term food preservation is something that shouldn't be overlooked because there is a lot of food waste. Generally, in Canada, I don't have the stats with me. It is staggering how much food is thrown away, not just from the processing end, but once it gets into our home. So storing greens especially, it is worth a minute to take good care of them. What they need is air and moisture. They need that combination. And okay, we'll talk about the moldy issue in a second. They need that combination, and without both of those things, obviously without moisture, your greens are going to dry out, but not in a good way. And without air, if you ever think of cucumbers that come in plastic and you store it in there, you end up with mush. So anything that allows moisture and air in terms of storage is fabulous. You'll see lots of zero waste fridge pictures where they'll use, awesome mason jars and store their greens standing up. That is something that does not happen in my home because it is the first thing that gets knocked over, and then I'm cleaning up water from the entire fridge, which is a great time to clean up the fridge, but I don't want to do that. So I have my kale stored in a beeswax wrap, which is fabulous because it does breathe and it does keep the moisture in. A cloth, a natural fiber cloth that is slightly damp will do the same thing. And you'll find you just get so much longer life out of your greens. Most produce, but particularly greens because they do wilt, that it's worth putting that time in because then you just decrease the amount of waste that's going to happen. So I don't know how long this has been sitting in my fridge, but it's still completely fresh. It's been well over a week. So I tore the leaves into small pieces. Again, because I'm working with the shape of my dehydrator, I can't do one big leaf. I don't want to cover this. This is where the where the air comes up mostly. Can you bring it back to life once wilted? Some things, yes. Cold water often does the trick. The best bet is to cook it because once it's cooked, it's supposed to wilt, right? So you're just helping it along. So I can add these as is back to either add them to water to use for cooking, or just add them right into something like a soup or a stew or a stir fry, and they will rehydrate, which is fabulous. And this is sort of a bite-sized piece. What we do mostly in our home is crumble it up. And this is usually my son's job. I'll put it in a some kind of sealed bag and he can just play with it and just outside the bag and crumble it up. 25 to 12. Okay. Okay, I don't know how to see the whole message. I only saw 25 to 12.
It's Steve. Yeah,
oh, hi.
It's 25 to 12, but there is no session at 12 o'clock, Susan. So if you wanted to go a little longer, you can.
Okay, we'll see. I think there's really only two more things. So we'll see how it goes, but thank you. So what we do once it's, once we've crumbled it, I don't want to say powdered, but it is pretty close to a powder. We store it in a jar, and that's what we use for our smoothies. And yes, you can certainly use fresh kale to put in a smoothie. Again, keeping track of, when it's fresh or how long it's going to stay fresh for just doesn't work for us. So we will do a whole bunch of kale at once. And that way, you can see we're getting close to the bottom of the jar here. And that way we always have it. And the great thing about using it dried is if you dehydrate it at the right temperature, which is usually as low as you can do it, you don't lose any of the nutrients, but you are getting a more concentrated flavor, and not just the flavor, but more concentrated nutrients. So if you can see here, I'm not going to crumble this perfectly. I usually use my immersion blender, but this was 2 tiny leaves of kale. So when I put in, you know, a tablespoon of this powdered kale, it's a lot of kale in one smoothie, but it doesn't seem like it because it's just powder. So it's a fabulous way to get all those greens in a really convenient way. So that was the part about, I have to flip back here. About consuming it in its dried state. So that's when using, you know, the powdered version is a fabulous option. And something which I'm sure most of us have done, which is, let me get one here. Dried apples. That is another example of drying it just as it is and using it just for this purpose, just for eating, for snacking. We have a giant jar here, and I just keep chopping it up. So someone asked about a risk of mold if it isn't dehydrated properly. That's when refrigeration would come in, because if you're not sure, the best option is to refrigerate it. Well, I guess the best option would be to keep dehydrating it. And there's nothing wrong with testing it. I mean, I'm in and out of the dehydrator several times to check, and I will get to a state where the kale, for example, because I have the kale here, might feel crispy, but when I go to crumble it, it bends instead of snaps. And then I know that there's still moisture in it and I need to do some more work. So I would just put it on for a bit longer. So I also have, hiding under here, this is green onions. So green onions I used as a cool example because drying them is fabulous. They're great, I think, to crumble on top of something because they give you that crunch and the oniony flavor. You can certainly rehydrate them. But what I love too about green onions is regrowing them. So anyone ever regrown vegetables from scraps? This is one of my favorite things. So this is the root end of a green onion. And this might be hard to see. I'm going to try and put it behind something. Can you see that the root has started to grow? And that's just been in the water for a day or so. And then if you look at the top, can you see that tiny bit of light green that's a little bit thinner than the rest of it? That's what's regrown. Beets, greens, excellent. They're really fun. This is one example where it will regrow. It's not just the leaves, like an example of carrots, but you will actually get another green onion. So water is a great option. You do have to keep changing it. Onions in a pot. I was just going to say, as soon as they have a bit of root, I definitely plant mine outdoors. I actually have some that overwintered outside on the balcony. And with the last few days of sunshine, they've started to grow, which is so exciting. So it's a great thing. You buy it once and you just keep regrowing them. Or if you know anyone who doesn't want to regrow their own, take their root ends. All you need is about, I don't know what the smallest amount, 1 centimeter or 2, just enough to basically need the roots and a little bit of green, and then off you go, which is really fun. So it's a great thing to experiment with as well, but I digress. So now we're going to talk about creating something new out of food that you're preserving. And my favorite example, oh, first of all, I have to tell you about fruit, dehydrating fruit. So this is dehydrated strawberries, which you may see when, you know, in granola. They are delightful. They are truly delightful. There's a fine line between getting all the moisture out so they're dehydrated and being so hard that you can't chew them, but they're incredible. I'm going to warn you now, when it's summer and you see watermelon, when you dehydrate watermelon, your life will change entirely. It is nature's most amazing candy, especially if you do it in sticks. You get these sticks of like chewy, intensely watermelon flavored delight. You can't even imagine. If you haven't tried it, you have to. Ours doesn't last very long, sadly. So by September, it's gone. It does take a long time. You cut it really thin, but it's worth it. Trust me. And the great thing about dehydrating, once it's in the dehydrator or the oven, you don't have to do anything. It's hands-off time. So what we're going to do is, I don't know if anyone is following along, we're going to make a fruit roll-up, fruit leather. I grew up calling it fruit leather. I don't know if I'm supposed to call it leather anymore. And the reason I'm doing this particularly is because there are no rules, which is awesome. Dehydrating in the oven is basically the lowest the oven will go. And I can't remember if newer ovens go lower or don't go low enough. So anything around 170 is the highest you want to go. And this is a blanket statement. There are lots of different recommendations for preserving the nutrients in different foods. Anything higher than that, it starts to cook. So there are lots of different ways you can slow that down. Some people will turn the oven on to reach that temperature, turn it off, keep the light on in the oven, prop the door open, which isn't a constant temperature, so it does take a little bit of fiddling, but absolutely doable. And it does take a little bit more checking in than setting a temperature on a dehydrator, but still a lot of fun. And it's kind of neat because you are checking the progress as it goes. So what I'm going to do is a quick fruit leather, which have an example here in my dehydrator. And this was strawberry banana. So I did have to use parchment because I couldn't find the tray that's solid. So this is parchment. And I just spread a thin layer. And here's my fruit leather. So to store this, well, you can do it any way you want. You can store it in pieces. You can store it rolled up. Some people do store it in the freezer. You don't need to. This one you can hear. You'll be able to hear. You can hear that it's dry and it's crispy. This one here, I just have stored in a jar and I keep it in the pantry. So this one is bananas, cherries. Okay, so most of the time when you are making some kind of fruit leather, it needs moisture, and which seems kind of odd because you're going to be dehydrating it, but it needs moisture in terms of making it spreadable. I'm a big fan of popping bananas in the freezer before, when they're a little too ripe to eat, and that's because my family's fussy, but I don't want to leave them on the counter so they'll go bad. So I've just put a banana in. This one wasn't in the freezer, but it is very, very ripe. And then I've got some strawberries here. And these are the strawberries that are a little dried out, that no one in my family is going to eat. And this is another thing, if you're buying, especially organic strawberries, this, I don't want to say just the stem or the leaves, but the part that actually has a little bit of strawberry on it. Drying this is awesome to add to tea. The flavor is really, really intense. And I think strawberry leaves are good for you, but I can't remember why. So we'll just skip over that part. So I'm going to put the last of my strawberries in. And what my family doesn't know is I use kombucha to add a little bit of liquid. And I'm just putting in, I don't know, a splash is what I'm going to say. So I have to slide over here. I'm using my immersion blender, which is probably my favorite thing in the home because it is so easy to use. I'm not pulling out a giant piece of equipment, and it can do small batches, which is really great. You can certainly use a potato masher. You can use a fork. You can put it inside a plastic bag and smush it down. It really doesn't matter. So, pardon the noise. This will be fast. Okay, and that's all there is to it. You can leave it a little bit chunky, or you can make sure it's finely mixed. It's totally up to you. So I'm going to take my finished one off. And my green onions that are sliding through there. And I've cut this parchment paper. The great thing about doing it in the oven is you can just use, there are so many more options. So you can use wax paper, you can use parchment paper. Parchment paper is compostable, which is awesome. Silpat sheet, silicone sheet, if you have one, is fabulous too. And I'm going to take some of this and spread it out here. And you do want to try and spread it evenly. It will start to dry out from the edges in. So you don't want the edges to be super, super thin. It makes an uneven drying time. And the reason I'm only putting some of this in is because I want to show you how you get to play around. So this is banana strawberry with some kombucha in it. So I've just spread that out, not super, super thin, but that's something you can play with as well. Depends how impatient you are in the drying process. But here's the fun part. I am going to add, what was I going to add? Oh, I'm going to add some kale. And I'm not adding the dried kale because I happen to have some fresh. So just a few pieces. So I'm going to mix that up again. Okay, I'm being impatient because you don't need to sit and listen to my immersion blender, but I'm going to pour a little bit of this out. So the kale, I haven't, it's still in pieces there, which is totally fine, unless you're trying to hide vegetables from your family. And then what I'm going to do with this one, with what's left in here, is play a little bit more because I can. And this is going to become, there isn't a name for this. I want to say it's more of a fruit leather cracker kind of thing. I'm adding some bran. You can add any combination of nuts and seeds, flax. You might want to look up a recipe so you can remember how to make the same one for the next time, but I don't do that. So I'm going to mix that one up. Okay, and this one will be quite a bit, well, the texture will be different. It's much thicker, kind of pasty. And obviously a different texture once it's dried. If I went lighter on the fruit and stuck to a bit of vegetable pulp and nuts and seeds and grains, then it would definitely be more cracker-like. This is sort of a, well, it's a hybrid. And there we go. So I've got those in there, and oops, I'll pop the lid on. I'm not going to turn it on now, but that would sit for about 24 hours. And like I said, that's for my dehydrator. For the thickness that I've done those, will sit for about 24 hours. And if some of them are done, I will pull them out. And if some of them aren't done, I will return it to keep going. And I can just check on them periodically. So does that one become more crispy? It can. Again, it depends how long you dehydrate it for. The grains definitely can make it crispier, which is what I'm going for. It depends how impatient people are as well. My family tends to like crispy as opposed to chewy. So I tend to dry things until like this fruit leather, it snaps, whereas some is very soft and pliable, but that's totally a personal preference. I know you will see recipes for making your own crackers, which a lot of people who do juicing, is that the right term? Yeah, where you end up with pulp, say, you know, carrot pulp or, well, beets. Yeah, or even just using beets as a base. You know, like say half of a cooked beet, and then you add in all your grains and seeds, sesame seeds and poppy seeds and any kind of, you know, ground almonds, anything like that. And you do need something liquidy, like a fruit or vegetable pulp, to hold all the grains together, but you can end up with a cracker, which is pretty cool. And sometimes it's just from leftovers, which is really neat. Like, you know, in this case, none of this was left over, but you can certainly do that. You know, someone didn't eat their beets at dinner, you can certainly dehydrate them and play around and mix them with something and come up with, I guess it can be a snack, but it can be just its own food, which is pretty awesome. So I'm going to take a quick look at my screen and see if there's anything I haven't covered, since we are at time. And my mouse is now sitting in smoothie. So, oh, good. So my closing thought is have fun. I hope you've had fun watching this. There is no lack of information out there, whether it's in books or online or groups that get together virtually these days to talk about different ideas about food preservation. It is a lot of fun, and the possibilities truly are endless. So explore, enjoy, and make the most of supporting local, which brings me to this thought. So not that I gave a lot of detail in the presentation, but if you are interested in a PDF version, you can just pop your email address in the chat and I will send it out to you. I also have a PDF that I put together for another talk that I do that is 10 easy steps to a zero waste home. And if anyone is interested in that, same thing, just pop your email in the chat and I'd be happy to send that out. It's a fun thing. And here's my push for supporting small business and supporting local. People keep saying it's more important now than ever. I think it's always been important. And it's something we've got away from when, if you think back, you know, a few generations, probably not even that long, where local was the only choice you had. So there were a lot of small businesses, small farmers, and small producers of all sorts of wonderful things. So supporting them and supporting me if you want to. The best way, the easiest way, the cheapest way to support anyone is to follow them on social media and spread the word. So that is, that's me for today. And if there are any questions that I didn't see from the chat, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, enjoy all your food.
Susan, it's Steve. You rocked that presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Marie does a lot of preserving in our home, and you covered a bunch of things.
Specifically,
Well,
What's your
canning
favorite?
and dehydrating.
Yeah.
We have a small farm and we dehydrate a lot of things, but you covered things that we haven't considered. So that's really exciting to see your passion for it and how creative you can
Well,
get.
someday we can do it in person.
Yeah, wouldn't that be awesome?
That's what I kept thinking, like picturing a big farm table where everyone gets to like play with their food would be so much fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that your parents used to tell you don't play with your food, and you're telling us too. So that's awesome. Yeah, we are out of official time, so I'm going to stop the recording in a second. And I just once again thank you so much for being here. And you know, everything that you've talked about is exactly the messages that Transition Guelph has been talking about for a while. It's great to see small business owners like yourself promoting that very same message. It's local resilience live
Yes.
in person. So thank you so much for what you do in
And
the
you know what?
community.
Local, I mean, you know, we can all click a button and get something from Amazon the next day, but local in its own way is really easy too. I actually came across a discussion just a couple of days ago where people were like, I'd love to support local, but I don't know where to look.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow. Because once you have your favorite, you know, your favorite butcher or your favorite farm or your favorite, you know, market stall, it's easy. But finding them isn't always easy because they're not necessarily all online. They're not pushing themselves on social media.
Yeah.
And it is a little trickier to get the word out.
Yeah.
So that's on behalf of every small business and producer in the region.
Thank you. I will put a plug in for Taste Real here in Wellington County. If you Google Taste Real, they've got a great resource. It's not complete for the Wellington County, but it covers a lot of food related small businesses and whatnot. So and producers.
Oh, that's fabulous. Love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm hitting the stop recording here, but we can go a little further.